They say that time heals all wounds, but they are mistaken. Time does not heal. It merely teaches us how to live with the scars. And sometimes, the oldest scars are the ones that hurt the most when someone deliberately presses upon them. For Alara Vance, a woman in her early 50s living a life so quiet it was almost silent in a small, forgotten town in Ohio, her scars were a tapestry she had learned to ignore. Her existence was a gentle rhythm of wiping down diner counters, the scent of coffee and grease clinging to her apron, tending to the small garden in her backyard that yielded more peace than produce, and evenings spent in the soft glow of a single lamp. This peace was not a choice born of desire, but a fortress she had meticulously built over 15 long years, a fortress to protect herself and her 2 children from the memory of a husband who had vanished like smoke on a windy day. Then, on an unremarkable Tuesday morning, the walls of that fortress were not breached by tragedy, but obliterated by a miracle. A single Powerball ticket, purchased out of habit from the corner store, held the 6 numbers that would rewrite her reality: $350 million. The number was so vast, so astronomical, that it felt like a clerical error. The town, once a quiet backdrop to her life, erupted with the news. Alara Vance, the woman who worked double shifts, the woman who always had a kind but weary smile, was suddenly the subject of every conversation. She felt a dizzying mix of elation and sheer terror. She saw a future free from debt for her children, Liam, now 25, and Chloe, 21. A future where their dreams were not limited by her paycheck. But deep within the joy, a cold, familiar dread began to stir, a whisper from a past she thought was long buried. That dread took shape just 48 hours later. A sleek black car, utterly alien against the backdrop of her modest neighborhood, purred to a stop in front of her home. The man who emerged was older, his hair flecked with gray, but he wore the same confident, predatory smile she remembered from her nightmares. It was Marcus, her husband. He had not come to apologize or to see his children. He had come with a man in a crisp suit carrying a leather briefcase. He stood on the porch of the home he had abandoned, and through his lawyer, he made his demand, his voice devoid of any emotion but entitlement. Under the laws of the state of Ohio, as they had never officially divorced, he was still her legal husband, and he was there to claim his rightful share, 1/2 of everything. To understand the chilling audacity of the man standing on her porch, you must first understand the ghost he used to be. You have to rewind the clock 15 years, back to a time when Alara's world was much smaller, but infinitely more complicated. Back then, Marcus Vance was not a ghost. He was the sun around which her entire family orbited. He was a man built of charm and empty promises, with a smile that could talk a bird out of a tree, and a work ethic that barely managed to get him out of bed before noon. His life was a series of grand pronouncements and half-finished projects. He was always on the verge of a breakthrough, a revolutionary idea that would make them rich beyond their wildest dreams. There was the patented stain remover that turned out to be mostly lemon juice and baking soda, the internet startup for which he never quite finished the website, and the real estate seminar that cost them 2 months' rent but yielded no results. He spoke of ambition and potential. But what he truly possessed was a profound laziness, a deep-seated belief that he was owed a life of luxury without the inconvenience of earning it. And Alara, in the way that only a devoted wife can, believed him. She didn't just love the man he was, she loved the man he promised he would one day become. She was the steady hand to his flighty dreams, the one who worked the extra shifts at the diner to pay for his latest investment, the one who soothed the children when he was in a foul mood after another one of his brilliant schemes had fizzled out. She saw his charm, not as a tool for manipulation, but as a sign of his untapped greatness. Their life wasn't easy, but it was hers. It was the scent of freshly cut grass as Liam practiced baseball in the yard, the sound of Chloe's laughter as she drew with chalk on the driveway, the warmth of Marcus's hand in hers as they watched television in the evening. She thought these small moments were the bricks they were using to build a life together, never realizing he saw them as the bars of a cage. The day he left was a Thursday. He had been electric for a week, pacing the small house, making hushed phone calls, a manic energy sparkling in his eyes. He told her, this was it. the big one. A contact in Chicago, a surefire investment in tech logistics, a ground floor opportunity. He painted a vivid picture of their future. A sprawling house in the suburbs, private schools for the children, vacations to places she had only seen in magazines. "This is for us, Alara," he had said, his voice a low, convincing hum. "I just need to go there, get things settled. I'll be back for you and the kids before you know it. Just trust me." And so she did. She watched him pack a single bag. She watched him kiss a sleeping Chloe on the forehead and ruffle a confused Liam's hair. He held her face in his hands, kissed her deeply, and whispered, "Our new life is about to begin." Then he walked out the door and out of their lives. The first week was filled with anxious hope. The second, with a gnawing worry. By the third week, when the phone remained silent and her calls went to a disconnected number, the worry began to curdle into a cold, sickening dread. The final, devastating blow came when she went to the bank to withdraw money for groceries and was told their joint savings account was empty. He hadn't just left. He had plundered. He had taken every last dollar they had, the money she had painstakingly saved from tips, the emergency fund meant for a broken-down car or a sick child. He had taken their past and their future, leaving her with nothing but 2 bewildered children and a stack of unpaid bills. The aftermath was a long, slow-motion fall into a life she had never imagined. Her first call was to his mother, Beatrice. She had hoped for comfort, for help, perhaps even an explanation. What she received was venom. "You must have driven him to it," Beatrice had spat through the phone line, her voice dripping with accusation. "My son is a visionary. He needs support, not the constant nagging of a small-minded woman. He went to find his destiny, a destiny you were holding him back from." In that one cruel conversation, Ilara understood she was utterly alone. The world shrank to the size of her own desperate struggle. She sold her mother's necklace. She sold the good furniture. She took a second job cleaning office buildings at night, a ghostly figure moving through deserted hallways after her shift at the diner. She learned to survive on 4 hours of sleep, fueled by cheap coffee and a ferocious, primal need to protect her children. She became an expert at smiling through exhaustion, at turning bill collectors' calls into a game of telephone tag, at mending clothes that should have been thrown away. She cried, but only in the solitude of her car, parked for 10 minutes between her 2 jobs, where the children couldn't see her fragile shield of motherhood crack. Liam, old enough to understand the betrayal, watched his mother grow thinner and more tired, and a quiet, hardened anger took root in his heart. Chloe, too young to remember her father's face, only knew a world where her mother was a constant, warm, and perpetually weary presence. Alara had fought and scraped and bled, emotionally and financially, to build a life from the ashes Marcus had left behind. She had built a fortress of peace, not of wealth, and had finally, after 15 years, learned to live with her scars. And now, the man who had inflicted every single one of them was standing on her porch, not with remorse in his eyes, but with the cold calculation of a creditor come to collect a debt she did not owe. The man on the porch smiled, a slow, practiced movement that didn't reach his eyes. It was the same smile he had used to sell bad ideas, to excuse late nights, and to make promises he had no intention of keeping. For a disorienting moment, Alara felt the 15 years separating them collapse, the ghost of the young woman who had loved this man rising up inside her. But the feeling was fleeting, extinguished by the cold reality of the expensive suit he wore and the impassive man standing beside him. Marcus took a step forward, his polished shoe landing on the welcome mat she had bought for $3 at the discount store. "Ellie," he said, his voice a smooth, rich baritone she had almost forgotten. "You look, well, the simple life suits you. Though I suppose it's not so simple anymore." He gestured vaguely at her small, tidy house, as if it were a temporary inconvenience he had returned to demolish. "I heard the news. Incredible. But then again, I always knew you had a lucky streak. I always told you that, didn't I?" His words were meant to be a bridge, an attempt to conjure a shared history that he himself had set on fire. He was acting as if he had just been away on a long business trip, expecting to pick up a conversation left unfinished. Alara remained silent, her hand gripping the edge of the door so tightly her knuckles were white. The silence stretched, becoming a tangible thing between them, a space filled with every meal she had cooked for one, every parent-teacher conference she had attended alone, every night she had lain awake, worrying about money. The air was thick with the unsaid, and Marcus's smile finally began to falter. He cleared his throat. "Well, aren't you going to invite us in? This is Mr. Hayes, my legal counsel. We have some important family matters to discuss." "You are not family," a voice cut through the air, sharp and hard as broken glass. Liam appeared in the doorway behind his mother, his body instantly forming a protective barrier. At 25, he was a tall, broad-shouldered young man who carried the weight of a childhood spent as the man of the house. He had his mother's steady eyes, but right now they were blazing with a cold fury that made him look dangerously like his father. "You lost the right to use that word when you walked out that door 15 years ago. Get off our property. Now." Marcus's expression shifted, the manufactured charm replaced by a flash of annoyance. "Liam, my boy. Look at you, all grown up. You shouldn't speak to your father that way." "He's not my father," Liam snarled, taking a step forward. "A father doesn't steal his children's future and vanish. A father doesn't let his wife work herself to the bone while he's off doing God knows what. You're just a stranger who needs to leave." It was then that Chloe appeared, drawn by the raised voices. She hovered behind her brother, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and a deep, unsettling curiosity. She had no real memory of this man. To her, he was a collection of faded photographs and cautionary tales, a mythical creature who had now materialized on their front porch. She saw the expensive suit, the confident posture, the face that was a strange, aged echo of her own brother's. She saw a man who looked important, powerful, and a flicker of conflict crossed her face. This was her father. The word itself held a weight she had never been able to measure. Marcus immediately saw his opening. His gaze softened as he looked past Liam's hostile frame and focused on her. "Chloe," he said, his voice becoming gentle, almost paternal. "My beautiful girl, you were just a little thing. I bet you don't even remember me." The targeted tenderness was a calculated blow, and it infuriated Liam even more. But before he could speak again, the lawyer, Mr. Hayes, stepped forward. He was a man who seemed to have no temperature, his face a bland mask of professionalism. "Perhaps we can dispense with the theatrics," he said, his voice calm and monotonous. "Mrs. Vance, or should I say, Ilara. My client, Marcus Vance, is here to establish his legal rights. While we understand this is an emotional situation, the law is quite clear on the matter." He opened his briefcase, not to produce a document, but as a gesture of authority. Under the revised code of the state of Ohio, any and all assets, property, or income acquired by either spouse during the course of a marriage is considered marital property. As you and Mr. Vance were never legally divorced, your marriage is still, in the eyes of the law, fully intact. Therefore, your recent lottery winnings constitute a marital asset. Every word was a perfectly polished stone, dropped into the quiet pond of Ilara's life, sending shocking ripples out to its very edges. She stared at the lawyer, the buzzing in her ears drowning out the sound of the birds chirping in her garden. It was absurd. It was grotesque. He was using the vows she had honored to rob her, using the legal bond he had shattered through abandonment as a weapon against her. She felt a wave of nausea, but then something else rose up to meet it. A cold, hard anger, clearer and more potent than anything she had felt in years. This was not just about the money. It was about the audacity, the sheer, breathtaking arrogance of a man who could inflict so much pain and then return to demand a reward for it. He wanted to steal from her twice. First, he stole her youth and her trust. Now, he wanted to steal the future she had miraculously been given, the future she had earned through 15 years of lonely, back-breaking labor. While Liam continued to argue, his voice cracking with rage, and Chloe stood frozen in confused silence, Ilara's focus sharpened. She looked past Marcus's smug face, past the condescending pity in his eyes. She looked directly at the impassive lawyer, the man who spoke of laws but knew nothing of justice. The fear that had been her constant companion for so long was gone, burned away by the white-hot flame of her indignation. She would not be a victim in her own home. She would not let this ghost from her past devour her future. She finally lowered her hand from the doorframe, her posture straightening, her spine turning to steel. She took a breath, and when she spoke, her voice was not the shaky, tired voice of a diner waitress. It was the voice of a queen defending her fortress. "Tell your client," she said, her words quiet, yet resonating with an unshakable finality, "that he will be hearing from my lawyer." The defiant words, spoken with such conviction on her own porch, seemed to echo in the sudden silence that followed Marcus's departure. But as the sleek black car disappeared down the street, the adrenaline that had turned her spine to steel began to drain away, leaving a familiar, bone-deep weariness in its place. The fortress had held for a moment, but now she could see the cracks. Her bold declaration of having a lawyer was a bluff, a desperate shield thrown up in the heat of battle. In reality, she had no one. The legal world was as alien to her as the surface of the moon. That evening, after a tense and quiet dinner where Liam's anger simmered and Chloe's confusion was a palpable presence at the table, Alara sat with a phone book, its thin pages feeling as heavy as a law library. She found a name, Evelyn Reed, an attorney recommended months ago by a regular at the diner for a minor property dispute. The woman had been described as no nonsense, but fair. It was the only lead she had. Evelyn Reed's office was not the intimidating glass and chrome fortress Alara had imagined. It was in a modest brick building, the rooms filled with the scent of old paper and lemon polish. The walls were lined not with plaques and awards, but with overflowing bookshelves. Evelyn herself was a woman in her late 60s, with sharp, intelligent eyes that seemed to see more than Alara was comfortable with. She listened, truly listened, as Alara recounted the story, not just of Marcus's return, but of the 15 years that preceded it. She spoke of the struggles, the sacrifices, the quiet humiliations, her voice steady but threaded with the phantom exhaustion of it all. She laid out the landscape of her life, hoping the sheer injustice of her story would be a weapon in itself. When she finished, Evelyn leaned back in her leather chair, which sighed under her weight. She didn't offer empty platitudes or reassurances. Instead, she offered the cold, unvarnished truth. "Alara," she began, her voice calm and measured, "I'm going to be very direct with you. Morally, you don't owe that man a single cent. In fact, one could argue he owes you 15 years of back pay for a life of hard labor. But the law is not always concerned with morality. The law is concerned with facts and statutes." She tented her fingers. "And the central, brutal fact of this case is that you are still legally married. You never filed for divorce, and neither did he. He was never declared legally dead. In the eyes of the state of Ohio, his 15-year absence is no different than if he were a soldier deployed overseas or a man working on an oil rig in another state. It's an absence, not a dissolution of the marital contract." Evelyn went on to explain the chilling mechanics of the law. How, without a divorce decree or a legal separation agreement that specifically outlines the division of future assets, the marital pot continues to exist. Any wealth accumulated by either party through any means flows into that pot. "His lawyer is correct," Evelyn concluded, her gaze softening with a hint of sympathy. "The lottery prize is a marital asset. He has a very, very strong claim to half of it. We can fight it, of course. We can argue abandonment, emotional distress. We can countersue for financial support for the past 15 years. It will be a messy, expensive, and very public fight. And in the end, a judge might award you a slightly larger percentage in acknowledgement of his desertion, perhaps 60 or 70%. But Marcus will walk away with a life-changing amount of money, an amount he did absolutely nothing to deserve." A profound sense of helplessness washed over Alara. It was a feeling worse than when she had discovered the empty bank account. Back then, she was a victim of a man's cruelty. Now, she was a victim of the very system designed to uphold fairness. The law, with its cold, impartial logic, was providing the tools for him to rob her all over again, this time in broad daylight, with a judge's blessing. She had survived his betrayal. She had raised their children. She had weathered the storm. And now that a miracle had finally brought her a lifeboat, the law was insisting she had to invite the man who pushed her overboard to climb in with her. She drove home from the lawyer's office in a daze, the world outside her car window seeming distant and unreal. The hope that had bloomed so brightly just days before was now withering under the harsh glare of legal reality. That evening, the phone rang, its shrill cry an intrusion into her somber thoughts. She saw an unknown number and let it ring, but the caller was persistent. Finally, she answered, and a voice she hadn't heard in years, a voice like the scrape of rust on metal, slithered through the line. "Ilara, it's Beatrice. I think it's high time we had a little chat." Ilara's blood ran cold. She said nothing, but Beatrice didn't need a response to continue her assault. "I heard you're being difficult," she began, her tone a cloying mix of false concern and accusation. "I heard my son came to see you, to share in his good fortune, and you treated him like a criminal." "His good fortune?" Ilara whispered, the words catching in her throat. "Of course, dear," Beatrice said, her voice dripping with condescension. "That money is a blessing for our family. It's the universe finally rewarding Marcus for all his hard work, for all the years he spent trying to build a better life. You have no idea what that man has been through, the sacrifices he's made. And now, when he's finally on the verge of getting what he's owed, you want to be selfish. You want to keep it all for yourself." The words were a torrent of poisonous delusion. Beatrice painted a picture of Marcus as a noble pioneer, a tragic hero, conveniently erasing the 15 years of neglect and cruelty. "A man needs a wife who builds him up, Ilara, not one who anchors him down. If you had just had a little more faith, a little more vision, maybe he never would have had to leave in the first place. You think you're the only one who suffered? Imagine my pain, as a mother, watching my brilliant boy have to go out into the cold, hard world alone." Ilara stood in her kitchen, the phone pressed to her ear, listening to this grotesque rewriting of history. The despair that had settled in her heart after her meeting with Evelyn began to burn away, replaced by a scalding, clarifying rage. Beatrice was not just defending her son, she was trying to invalidate Ilara's entire existence, to erase her 15 years of struggle, as if they were nothing more than a footnote in the grand story of Marcus Vance. The manipulation was so blatant, so shameless, that it was almost breathtaking. "That money is his due, Ilara." Beatrice's voice hardened, the false sweetness gone. "It's his destiny. And you have a legal and moral duty to give him his half. If you fight him on this, you won't just be a greedy woman, you'll be a wicked one, standing in the way of your own husband's happiness." Something inside Ilara snapped. The helplessness, the fear, the crushing weight of injustice, it all crystallized into a single, sharp point of resolve. Beatrice's cruel, manipulative phone call was the worst mistake she could have made. It was a reminder of the toxic, self-serving world Marcus came from. It was a reminder that this was never just about one man's greed. It was about an entire worldview that saw her as nothing more than a supporting character in someone else's story. She did not scream. She did not argue. She simply took a deep breath, and with a steady hand, she ended the call, cutting off Beatrice mid-sentence. The silence that followed was not empty. It was filled with the sound of a new war being declared, not in a courtroom or a lawyer's office, but in the quiet, resolute heart of a woman who had finally been pushed too far. The rage that had solidified in her heart after Beatrice's phone call did not dissipate. Instead, it cooled, hardening from a molten, emotional fury into something far more dangerous, a cold, sharp, and patient resolve. In the quiet hours of the night, when the house was still and the weight of her new reality pressed down, Ilara found herself replaying the confrontation on her porch. She sifted through the memories, not of the hateful words or the legal threats, but of the smaller, almost imperceptible details. She remembered the way Marcus had adjusted his tie, a nervous tic he always had when he was cornered. She remembered the unnatural stiffness in his shoulders. But most of all, she remembered his eyes. For a fleeting second, when Liam had stepped in front of her, the arrogance in Marcus's eyes had been eclipsed by a flash of something else. It was not anger. It was raw, primal panic. That single image became the focal point of her thoughts. Greed, she understood. Marcus was the living embodiment of greed. But this felt like more. This was the frantic energy of a man whose life depended on this money. It was a desperation that went beyond the simple desire for a life of luxury. His sudden reappearance, timed so perfectly with the announcement of her winnings, was not the act of an opportunist who had been patiently waiting in the wings. It was the act of a man who had heard a dinner bell ringing across a barren wasteland where he was starving. Beatrice's phone call, with its bizarre, hysterical defense of her son, only served to reinforce this nagging intuition. Their aggression was a sign not of strength, but of profound weakness. They were pushing so hard because they had no other choice. For 15 years, Alara had survived by being reactive, by absorbing blows and finding a way to keep standing. She had patched holes, stretched pennies, and navigated the minefield of single motherhood by constantly adapting to the crises thrown at her. But she understood now that this was a different kind of fight. To play by their rules, to meet them in a courtroom and debate the finer points of marital property law, was to walk into a trap. Evelyn's words had been clear. On that battlefield, she would lose. Maybe not everything, but she would lose. She would be forced to give a fortune to the man who had caused her immeasurable suffering, and the injustice of it would poison the rest of her life. The thought was unbearable. No, the only way to win was to refuse to play their game. She had to create a new one, with new rules, on a battlefield of her own choosing. She had to stop looking at the lawsuit and start looking at the man. Marcus had a secret, and she would be the one to find it. The decision settled into her with a strange sense of calm. The next morning, she went back to Evelyn Reed's office. She didn't want to discuss legal strategy. She wanted information. "I need to find someone," she said, her voice steady. "A private investigator." Evelyn looked at her, a flicker of something new in her eyes, perhaps respect. She scribbled a name and a number on a piece of paper without a word. Frank Donovan, ex-homicide detective. Tenacious. Expensive. Disliked lawyers. Perfect. Frank Donovan's office was located above a dusty appliance repair shop, accessed by a narrow, creaking staircase. The room smelled of stale coffee and cynicism. The man himself matched the decor. He was in his 60s, with a crumpled shirt, a face like a roadmap of tired old towns, and eyes that seemed to have already seen and dismissed every possible human failing. He didn't rise when Alara entered. He simply gestured to a worn-out chair opposite his cluttered desk. "Evelyn Reed sent you," he grunted. "It wasn't a question. She only sends me the ones the law can't help." "So, what's the story?" Nervously at first, then with growing confidence, Alara laid it out. She didn't dwell on the emotional pain this time. She presented the facts as she knew them. "My husband, Marcus Vance, disappeared 15 years ago. He took all of our money. I haven't seen or heard from him since. 3 days ago, after I won the Powerball lottery, he reappeared with a lawyer to claim half. I want to know everything he has done, everywhere he has been, and everyone he has known from the day he left until the day he showed up on my porch." She pushed an old photograph across the desk, a picture of a younger, smiling Marcus from a forgotten family picnic. Frank picked up the photo, studying it with a practiced neutrality. He didn't offer sympathy. He asked sharp, practical questions. What was his line of work? Or his pretended line of work? Any known associates? Gambling habits? A taste for women? Booze? Something else? Did he have enemies when he left? Anyone he owed money to? Alara answered what she could, the details of a life she had tried hard to forget. Frank listened, making short, cryptic notes on a yellow legal pad. "It's a cold trail," he said finally, his voice a gravelly rasp. 15 years is a lifetime. He could have changed his name, lived off the grid. "It's a needle in a continent of haystacks, and it'll be expensive." "I understand," Ilara said, her resolve unwavering. "He's desperate. I saw it in his eyes. Desperate men get sloppy. They leave tracks." A ghost of a smile touched Frank's lips. "That they do." He named his price a retainer that made Elara's breath catch in her throat. It was more money than she had earned in a year at the diner. For a moment, she hesitated. This was the first significant sum she would spend from her winnings. The money that had brought this curse upon her was now the only thing that could fund her escape from it. She reached into her purse, took out the new checkbook that still felt alien in her hands, and wrote out the check. The act of signing her name felt momentous, a silent declaration of intent. She was no longer just the lottery winner. She was now a client, an employer, a woman who hired men like Frank Donovan to hunt in the darkness for her. She pushed the check across the desk. Frank glanced at it, then slid it into a drawer without a word. The transaction was complete. He stood up, a sign the meeting was over. "I'll be in touch," he said. As Alara walked down the creaking staircase and back into the bright afternoon sun, she didn't feel relief, not yet. The path ahead was still fraught with uncertainty. But the suffocating feeling of helplessness was gone. In its place was a quiet, thrumming sense of purpose. She had spent 15 years being a pawn in a game she didn't choose. Now, for the first time, she had moved a piece of her own. She had unleashed a hunter to track the ghost who haunted her, and she knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her soul, that the game had finally, irrevocably, changed. While Alara had enlisted a hunter to delve into the shadows of the past, Marcus and Beatrice began their own campaign, a war fought not with investigators and legal documents, but with whispers, manipulation, and the insidious poison of curated lies. Their first move was to establish a front. Marcus moved into his mother's impeccably clean, suffocatingly nostalgic house. The very house where Alara had once gone as a young bride, seeking a family's warmth, and found only cold judgment. Now, it became their war room, a headquarters for what they called the Reclamation. They were not mother and son comforting each other. They were two wolves circling a prize, their bond forged not of love, but of a shared, ravenous appetite. They knew a direct assault on Alara was a fool's errand. Her will had been forged in 15 years of hardship and was not easily broken. Liam, too, was a lost cause, his heart hardened by a loyalty to his mother that was absolute. But Chloe was different. She was the crack in the fortress. Their assault on Chloe was a masterful campaign of psychological seduction. Marcus did not approach her with demands or legal threats. He appeared to her as the father she never had, a figure of sorrowful regret and boundless generosity. He found her one afternoon at a cafe near her community college, where she was struggling with an old, slow laptop. He didn't sit down immediately. He just watched her for a moment, an expression of profound sadness on his face. When he finally approached, his voice was soft. He spoke of his deepest regret, of the mistakes a foolish young man makes, and of his dream of making things right. He never, ever criticized Alara directly. Instead, he framed her as a woman under immense stress, someone who was understandably overwhelmed and not seeing things clearly. He positioned himself as the calm, rational party, the one who simply wanted what was best for the entire family. Then came the gifts. They started small, an expensive coffee, a gift certificate to her favorite bookstore. Then they escalated. The next day, a brand new, top-of-the-line laptop was delivered to her apartment, a gift from your loving father, who wants you to have all the tools you need to succeed. A week later, it was a stunningly expensive designer handbag, something Chloe had only ever seen in magazines. These were not mere presents. They were tactical weapons. Each one was a gleaming, tangible symbol of the world of ease and opportunity Marcus represented, and a subtle, painful reminder of the world of limitations Alara had provided. Beatrice played her part perfectly, calling Chloe in the evenings, her voice dripping with grandmotherly affection. She spoke of family recipes she wanted to teach her, of European vacations they could all take together, of the debutante ball she never had. She was selling a fantasy, a ready-made life of privilege that was Chloe's for the taking. The poison worked. Chloe was torn. A part of her felt a deep, gut-wrenching guilt. She loved her mother, she respected her struggle, and she knew, on a rational level, that this was wrong. But another part of her, a part that had grown up wearing second-hand clothes and watching her friends leave for four-year universities she couldn't afford, was dazzled. This man was offering her a golden key to a life she had never dared to dream of. The conflict erupted into a painful confrontation one evening when Liam saw the new handbag sitting on the kitchen table. "You accepted that from him?" he demanded, his voice shaking with disbelief and betrayal. "After everything he did to Mom? To us?" "He's my father, Liam," Chloe retorted, her own voice rising. "He said he's sorry. He wants to make up for lost time. Is it so wrong that I want to know him? Is it so wrong to want a life where Mom doesn't have to work herself to death?" "That's not a life, Chloe. It's a bribe," Liam shouted. "He's buying you, and you're letting him." The fight was ugly, filled with years of shared hardship viewed through two very different lenses. To Liam, Marcus was a villain. To Chloe, he was a question mark, a possibility. Alara had to step between her own children, her heart breaking as she saw the first real casualty of Marcus's war, the unity of her family. Simultaneously, the second front of their war opened up in the small town that had been Alara's sanctuary. Marcus and Beatrice began a meticulous smear campaign. They didn't shout from the rooftops. They planted seeds of doubt in the fertile ground of small-town gossip. At the local church, Beatrice would speak tearfully of her son, who had finally come home, only to be met with a cold shoulder from a wife hardened by bitterness. Marcus would sit at the counter of the very diner where Alara worked, speaking to old acquaintances about his business ventures that had kept him away, carefully editing the narrative to sound like a noble sacrifice. The story they spun was simple and tragically effective. Marcus was the prodigal husband, returned to share in a blessing, and Alara, the woman everyone had pitied for so long, had revealed herself to be greedy and unforgiving. The shift in the town's atmosphere was subtle at first, then chillingly obvious. Alara felt it in the hesitation of a neighbor's wave, in the way conversations would suddenly stop when she entered the grocery store aisle, in the pitying glances that were now tinged with judgment. She, who had been a quiet pillar of their community, was now an outsider in her own life. They were isolating her, turning her own world against her, hoping the pressure would make her break. The loneliness was immense, a heavy cloak on her shoulders. But as she sat in her silent house, the sound of her children's angry words still echoing in the air, the coldness of her neighbors still fresh in her mind, something inside her did not break. It hardened. She looked at the expensive laptop on her daughter's desk, a Trojan horse in the heart of her family. She thought of the whispers and the judgmental stares. She was not just fighting for money. She was fighting for her story, for the truth of her 15 years of sacrifice. She was fighting for her children, to save one from a predator's charm and to honor the other's righteous anger. And in that quiet, lonely moment, her resolve became absolute. Let them whisper. Let them conspire. She had a hunter of her own, and he was digging in the dark. The days that followed blurred into a grueling routine of quiet endurance. Alara went to work at the diner, forcing a smile for her regular customers, all the while feeling the weight of their curious, sometimes judgmental, stares. She came home to a house thick with a tense, fragile silence, where Liam's protective anger and Chloe's conflicted guilt were like two opposing electrical currents, threatening to short-circuit at any moment. The gifts from Marcus continued to arrive for Chloe: concert tickets, an expensive coat, each one a beautiful, poisonous dart aimed at the heart of their family. Through it all, Alara waited. Every ring of the phone made her heart leap. Every unknown number was a potential harbinger of news. She had unleashed her hunter, and now all she could do was live in the suffocating stillness of the hunt, praying he would find something before the walls of her own life caved in. The call came on a gray Tuesday afternoon, nearly 3 weeks after her meeting with Frank Donovan. His voice on the other end of the line was devoid of pleasantries. "I've got a trail," he said, his voice a low gravel. "Not just a trail, I've got a whole damn story. You need to come to my office." When Alara arrived, the cluttered desk was different. In the center of it, in a cleared space, sat a single, thick manila file. It looked heavy, dense with secrets. Frank didn't waste time on small talk. He gestured for her to sit, opened the file, and began to narrate the last 15 years of Marcus Vance's life. It was not a story of a visionary entrepreneur, as Beatrice had claimed. It was a sordid, pathetic odyssey of a grifter living on the crumbling edge of failure. He never left Illinois for the first 6 months, Frank began, sliding a document across the desk. It was a copy of a court filing for a dissolved business partnership. He burned through your savings trying to launch a luxury car rental service with a partner. Turns out, the cars were just regular sedans he rented himself for the day to impress investors. The whole thing collapsed. The partner sued him for fraud, and Marcus vanished the night before the court date. This, Frank explained, was the template for Marcus's entire existence. He was a financial ghost, a wraith who drifted from one city to the next, leaving a trail of wreckage in his wake. From Chicago, he went to Phoenix, where he started a holistic wellnesses company that sold memberships to a non-existent retreat center. He collected the initial fees and disappeared. Then it was on to Las Vegas, a city perfectly suited to his particular blend of charm and desperation. There, he reinvented himself as a real estate consultant, preying on people's dreams of flipping houses. He would take a hefty finder's fee for a property and then vanish, the property itself hopelessly entangled in liens and legal problems. Frank had compiled a list of his failed ventures, a litany of deceit, lawsuits from betrayed partners, eviction notices, credit reports that were a sea of red ink, and a string of different names and social security numbers he had used. Marcus wasn't a failed businessman. He was a professional parasite, a man who lived by attaching himself to a host, draining it dry, and moving on to the next. Elara listened, a cold sickness spreading through her. This was the man she had once loved, the father of her children. The charismatic dreamer she remembered was just a mask for this hollow, predatory creature. But this is just small-time stuff, Frank continued, his voice dropping. It explains why he's broke, but not why he's so desperate. That part of the story starts in Vegas. In the city of lost wages, Marcus's already present gambling habit had metastasized into a full-blown addiction. He wasn't just losing his own scammed money. He was losing money he didn't have, which led him to his next, and most fatal, mistake. He got involved with a private lending group, Frank said, using the term with clinical distaste. Not the mob, not in the old-school sense. These are businessmen. They wear suits, they have corporate offices, but their collection methods are persuasive. They don't break your kneecaps, but they'll take your business, your house, your future. They ruin you systematically. Marcus had borrowed heavily, and when his luck ran out, as it always did, he did the only thing he knew how to do. He ran. He fled Las Vegas in the middle of the night, leaving behind a mountain of debt to some of the most unforgiving men in the country. He ended up in Florida, trying one last, desperate scheme involving fraudulent hurricane insurance claims. But his creditors had long memories and longer reach. They found him. "We don't know the specifics," Frank said, tapping a heavily redacted document. "But my source says about 6 months ago, there was an incident. His business partner from the Florida scheme ended up in the hospital with 2 broken legs. The official report says he fell off a ladder. Nobody falls off a ladder like that." Suddenly, everything clicked into place with horrifying clarity. Marcus's return wasn't an act of opportunistic greed. It was a terrified flight to sanctuary. He wasn't running to the money. He was running from the consequences of his life. He was a marked man, and his debt had finally come due. The news of his obscure wife in Ohio winning a $350 million lottery wasn't just a lucky break for him. It was a beacon. A public announcement to his dangerous creditors that the Vance family suddenly had the means to pay off his colossal debts. His desperation, the panic she saw in his eyes, was the terror of a man who knew what was coming for him if he failed. He wasn't just fighting for a life of luxury in a courtroom. He was fighting for his life, period. This realization didn't bring Elara any satisfaction. It brought a chilling fear. The man trying to legally attach himself to her and her children was not just a contemptible ex-husband. He was a magnet for the darkest kind of trouble, a walking liability who was drawing danger right to their doorstep. The fight was no longer about a percentage of her winnings. It was about building a firewall between her family and the inferno of his life. Elara looked down at the thick file on the desk, this ugly biography of a man she no longer knew. It was a chronicle of his failures, his deceits, his crimes. It was his entire life, reduced to a stack of damning paper. And she realized, with a clarity that was both terrifying and empowering, that she was not holding a legal shield. She was holding a weapon. Alara drove away from Frank Donovan's office with the thick, heavy file on the passenger seat beside her. It felt less like a collection of papers and more like a live, sleeping animal, something dangerous that could stir at any moment. The fear that had been a cold knot in her stomach was still there, but it had changed its nature. It was no longer the vague, helpless fear of a victim facing an unjust legal system. It was the sharp, focused fear of a person who has just looked through a rifle scope and seen the true nature of the enemy. Marcus was not just a threat to her financial future. He was a threat to her family's physical safety. His desperation, born from a life of cowardice and deceit, made him unpredictable. The dangerous men he was running from would not care about legal filings or courtroom etiquette. To them, Ilara's lottery win had painted a giant target on the back of the entire Vance family. This new knowledge did not make her want to retreat. It did not make her want to settle or compromise. It galvanized her. It transformed her simmering anger into a diamond-hard clarity. She had been playing defense, reacting to Marcus's moves, to Beatrice's calls, to the town's whispers. That was over. A cornered animal is at its most dangerous, and the only way to deal with it is to build a cage it cannot possibly escape. The next morning, she was back in Evelyn Reed's office. There was a new authority in her posture as she walked in. She was no longer just a client seeking advice. She was a commander bringing critical intelligence from the field. She placed Frank's file on the polished mahogany desk between them. "The situation has changed," Alara said, her voice even. "My husband isn't just looking for a payday. He's running for his life, and he's leading the danger straight to my children." Evelyn, with the practiced calm of a seasoned lawyer, spent the next hour reading through Frank's report. She absorbed the sordid details, the fraud, the lawsuits, the gambling debts, the chilling mention of persuasive lenders, her expression unreadable. When she finally looked up, the sympathy in her eyes was gone, replaced by a look of sharp, strategic focus. "Well," she said, closing the file, "this certainly changes the game. This is no longer an asset division case. This is a containment strategy." She leaned forward, her gaze intense. "Alara, fighting him on the grounds of marital property is like fighting a fire by arguing with the flames. It's pointless. We need to take away the fuel, all of it." Evelyn then laid out her plan, a legal maneuver so audacious and brilliant in its simplicity that it took Alara's breath away. "Right now," Evelyn explained, "the $350 million, minus taxes, is your asset. It's a vast sum of money in a bank account with your name on it. As your legal husband, he has a claim, however morally bankrupt, to that account. We need to make it so that the money is no longer yours." She held up a hand to stop Alara's confused protest. "I'm not talking about hiding it or spending it. I'm talking about fundamentally changing its legal identity. We are going to create an irrevocable trust." She explained the concept in simple, powerful terms. They would create a separate legal entity, a fortress of finance called the Vance Children's Trust. Alara would transfer the vast majority of her winnings into this trust. The sole beneficiaries would be Liam and Chloe. A neutral third-party trustee, a respected financial institution, would be appointed to manage the funds according to a strict set of rules. The money could only be used for the health, education, and well-being of the children, and for their future ventures. The key, Evelyn stressed, was the word irrevocable. Once you sign those papers, Alara, the money is gone. You cannot take it back. You cannot change your mind. It legally belongs to the trust, not to you. It is as separated from your personal assets as if you had donated it to charity. The genius of the move was its finality. Marcus was suing Alara Vance for a share of her property. But in a matter of days, Alara Vance would no longer be a multi-millionaire. She would be a woman of comfortable, but not extraordinary, means. The vast fortune would legally belong to her children, protected for their future. "His lawsuit will be rendered almost entirely pointless," Evelyn said with a thin smile. "He can't claim a marital share of an asset that doesn't exist. He would have to try and prove that you created the trust specifically to defraud him, a very high legal bar. And given his 15-year abandonment of the very children this trust is designed to protect, I can't imagine a judge in the country who would look favorably on that argument. For Ilara, the decision was a monumental one. It meant giving up control. It meant placing her family's miraculous fortune in the hands of strangers in suits. For a woman who had learned to trust no one but herself, it was a terrifying leap of faith. But then she thought of Marcus's desperate eyes, of the faceless, dangerous men who were hunting him. She thought of Chloe, blinded by the shine of his bribes, and of Liam, consumed by a righteous anger. What was the point of having a fortune if you couldn't sleep at night? What was the value of all that money if it came with a permanent attachment to the man who was the source of all her pain? The choice became simple. True wealth wasn't the number in a bank account. It was freedom. It was peace. It was safety. The next few days were a blur of meetings with financial advisors and trust officers. Ilara sat in sterile boardrooms, listening to talk of portfolios and fiduciary duties. She signed a mountain of documents, each signature a deliberate act of severing her ties to the bulk of the money. She kept a generous portion for her own needs, for her legal fees, and for a comfortable life. But the rest, the staggering, life-altering sum, was moved into the impenetrable fortress of the trust. When the final paper was signed, she didn't feel a sense of loss. She felt a profound, exhilarating lightness. The money had been a burden, a target, a curse. Now, it had been transformed. It was no longer a prize for Marcus to claim, but a shield for her children. It was a declaration of independence, written in the dry, powerful language of the law. That evening she went home and watched her children. They were still distant, the tension between them a low hum in the house. But she felt a new sense of peace. She hadn't just moved money. She had built a wall, a permanent, unbreachable wall between her children's future and their father's disastrous past. The trap was now set. All she had to do was wait for the animal to walk into it. The notification of the Vance Children's Trust did not arrive like a thunderclap. It came as a quiet, formal letter from Evelyn Reed's office to Marcus's lawyer, a document filled with the dry, sterile language of legal statutes and fiduciary responsibilities. But when that language was translated over the phone to Marcus, who was sitting in his mother's suffocatingly neat living room, it landed with the force of a death sentence. The words irrevocable, sole beneficiaries, and third-party trustee were not legal concepts to him. They were the sounds of a steel cage door slamming shut and locking him inside with the monsters he had been running from his entire life. The blood drained from his face. The phone slipped from his numb fingers and clattered onto the floor. For a moment, he was utterly still, the image of a man who had just seen his own ghost. Then, a guttural, inhuman sound of pure rage ripped from his throat. He was a blur of motion, grabbing his car keys, ignoring Beatrice's panicked questions, and storming out of the house. He drove the few miles to Ilara's home with a reckless, suicidal abandon, the powerful engine of his luxury car screaming in protest. This was not the calm, calculated arrival of his first visit. This was the charge of a wounded bull. He didn't park the car. He abandoned it, half on the curb, half on the street. He didn't walk up the path. He stormed it, his expensive shoes crushing the small flowers Ilara had planted by the walkway. He didn't knock on the door. He hammered on it with his fist, the rhythmic, violent thudding echoing through the quiet neighborhood. When Ilara opened the door, she was met with a version of Marcus she had not seen since the worst, darkest days of their marriage. The mask of the charming, repentant father was gone, burned away by the sheer, unadulterated terror that now consumed him. His face was a contorted mess of fury, his eyes wild and bloodshot. "You," he snarled, his voice a ragged mess. "What have you done? What in God's name have you done?" He pushed his way past her into the small living room, his presence a violation, a whirlwind of dark energy. Ilara didn't flinch. She had been preparing for this storm, and now that it was here, she felt a preternatural calm settle over her. "I've secured our children's future, Marcus," she said, her voice so steady it seemed to infuriate him even more. "Something you should have done a long time ago." "The children?" he shrieked, a hysterical laugh bubbling in his chest. "You think this is about the children? This was never about the children. This was about my survival. Do you have any idea what you've done to me? "You just signed my death warrant, you stupid, selfish bitch." He lunged forward, not to strike her, but to grab her by the shoulders, his fingers digging into her flesh like claws. "They're going to find me, Elara. They're going to take everything. And it will be your fault." In that instant, Liam came down the stairs, moving with a speed and fury that matched his father's. "Get your hands off." "My mother," he roared. He didn't hesitate. He slammed into Marcus with his full body weight, a hard, brutal shove that sent Marcus stumbling back, tripping over a coffee table. He fell to the floor in a clumsy, undignified heap. Liam stood over him, his chest heaving, his fists clenched, a son transformed into a protector, ready to tear apart the man who had given him life and then abandoned him to a world of pain. "Don't you ever," Liam seethed, his voice low and dangerous, "touch her again." It was into this tableau of primal rage and defense that Chloe walked in from the kitchen, a glass of water in her hand. She froze, the glass slipping from her fingers and shattering on the floor. She saw her brother, poised for violence. She saw her mother, standing tall but with the faint red marks of fingers on her arms. And she saw the man who had bought her a laptop, the man who had spoken of a bright future and family vacations, sprawled on the floor like a drunken madman, his face purple with a rage that was terrifying to behold. He scrambled to his feet, his eyes wild, and he pointed a trembling finger not at Liam, but at Elara. "This isn't over," he hissed, his voice thick with venom. "You think your little legal tricks can save you? You have no idea who you're dealing with. I will get that money. I don't care what I have to do. I don't care who gets hurt." And in that moment, the final, shimmering illusion in Chloe's mind was shattered. The gifts, the gentle words, the sad smiles, it was all a lie, a performance. This was the real man. A violent, screaming, terrified stranger who was threatening her mother, her brother, her home. The man on the floor was not a father. He was a monster. He saw her, his own daughter, not as a person to be cherished, but as a pawn to be used and a hurdle to be overcome. He saw their family not as a sanctuary, but as a bank to be robbed. The knowledge landed on her with the force of a physical blow, knocking the air from her lungs. She looked at the expensive handbag he had bought her, sitting on a nearby chair. It suddenly looked cheap, ugly, and stained. With a newfound clarity that was both painful and liberating, she stepped forward, placing herself beside Liam. She wasn't just standing next to her brother, she was choosing her side, once and for all. "You need to leave," she said, her voice shaking but clear. "Leave now, or I'm calling the police." The word police seemed to momentarily sober Marcus. He looked at his children, standing united against him. He looked at Elara, her face a mask of cold, unbreakable resolve. He was beaten. He had played his last, desperate card, and it had failed. With a final, choked sob of fury and despair, he turned and staggered out of the house, leaving behind the wreckage of his final assault. The front door slammed shut, and in the ringing silence that followed, the three of them, Elara, Liam, and Chloe, stood together amidst the shattered glass, a broken family finally, irrevocably, made whole again by the very monster who had tried to tear them apart. The day of the legal mediation arrived, not with a storm, but with the cold, sterile quiet of a hospital waiting room. The designated space was a conference room on the top floor of a downtown office building, a place utterly devoid of character. A long, polished table reflected the gray, overcast sky outside. Water pitchers beaded with condensation. The chairs were ergonomically designed but profoundly uncomfortable, built for conflict, not comfort. Marcus and his lawyer, Mr. Hayes, were seated first. Marcus had attempted to recapture his initial aura of a wronged gentleman, dressed in an impeccably tailored suit, but the frantic desperation of their last encounter still clung to him like a cheap cologne. There were dark circles under his eyes, and a muscle in his jaw twitched erratically. Mr. Hayes, however, was a picture of professional confidence, arranging his files with a crisp, deliberate air. He was a man about to perform a simple, logical amputation, and he saw no reason for it to be unpleasant. When Elara and Evelyn Reed walked in, the atmosphere in the room shifted. They were a study in quiet composure. Evelyn, with her sharp, knowing eyes, nodded curtly to the opposing counsel. Alara took her seat and looked not at Marcus, but at a point on the far wall, her expression calm, her posture radiating a strength that seemed to draw all the energy in the room toward her. She was no longer a victim. She was a sovereign power, present for the negotiation of a surrender. Mr. Hayes began, his voice smooth and reasonable. He spoke of the indissoluble legal bonds of matrimony, of the clear-cut statutes regarding marital assets in the state of Ohio. He was eloquent and persuasive. He painted a picture of Marcus as a husband who, though absent, had never legally or emotionally relinquished his role and was now seeking his rightful share in a surprising family windfall. He then moved on to the trust, describing it as a clear act of fraudulent conveyance, a desperate, last-minute maneuver designed in bad faith to alienate a spouse from their legal property. He suggested it was the impulsive act of a woman unaccustomed to wealth and overwhelmed by emotion, and that any reasonable court would see through the ploy. As he spoke, Marcus nodded along, a pained, noble expression fixed on his face, the very picture of a man being grievously misunderstood. When he finished, a self-satisfied silence filled the room. Evelyn let the silence hang for a moment before she spoke. She did not raise her voice. She did not argue. She simply and methodically dismantled his entire case. "Mr. Hayes," she began, "while your recitation of marital property law is admirable, it is also, in this case, entirely irrelevant." She produced her own set of documents, bound and tabbed. The Vance Children's Trust is a legally sound, professionally managed, and, most importantly, irrevocable entity. My client, Mrs. Vance, no longer possesses the asset you are attempting to claim. It does not belong to her. It belongs to the trust. You are, in effect, suing the wrong person for money she does not have. She went on to cite the precedents, the legal framework, and the absolute finality of the transfer. She concluded by noting that any attempt to prove fraudulent intent would require them to argue in open court that Mr. Vance, after 15 years of total abandonment and providing zero financial or emotional support, had a more compelling right to the money than the very children he had deserted. "I wish you the best of luck with that argument," she finished, a razor-thin smile on her lips. A visible change came over Mr. Hayes. The confident posture sagged. A slight sheen of sweat appeared on his brow. He began to shuffle his papers, rereading clauses, his mind racing to find a loophole where none existed. He knew, as a professional, that he had just been legally and comprehensively disarmed. His simple case had become a complex, uphill, and hideously expensive battle he was almost certain to lose. Marcus, sensing the shift, lost his composure. "This is ridiculous," he sputtered, his voice rising. "It's a trick. She's hiding the money. Tell them, Hayes. Tell them they can't do this." Alara had remained silent throughout the entire exchange. Now, she moved. Slowly, deliberately, she reached into the simple cloth bag at her feet and pulled out a thick, heavy manila file, Frank Donovan's file. She placed it on the table with a soft but definitive thud that silenced the room. The file itself seemed to radiate a grim authority. She did not look at the lawyers. She looked directly at Marcus, and for the first time since he had reappeared in her life, she saw him not as a ghost or a monster, but simply as a weak, frightened man in a cage of his own making. "This lawsuit is over, Marcus," she said, her voice quiet, yet carrying the weight of absolute finality. She slid the file across the polished table. It stopped directly in front of him. "I know about Chicago," she said. "I know about your partner, Robert Kessler, and the fraudulent incorporation of your logistics company. I know you walked away with $200,000 of investor money that was never seen again." Mr. Hayes's head snapped up, his eyes wide with alarm. Marcus's face went completely white. "What you may not know," Ilara continued, her voice like ice, "is that the statute of limitations for felony wire fraud in Illinois does not necessarily expire. It can be 10 years from the date the crime is reasonably discovered by the victim. Mr. Kessler, it seems, only recently discovered you were no longer a ghost. He is now very motivated to speak with the authorities." She leaned forward slightly, her eyes never leaving his. "So, you have two choices. and only two. Choice 1. You pick up that pen, you sign the withdrawal agreement Mr. Hayes has in his files, and you relinquish any and all present and future claims on me or my family. You will then walk out of this room, you will get in your car, and you will disappear from our lives as completely as you did 15 years ago. We will never see your face, hear your voice, or read your name again. That is choice 1. She paused, letting the weight of the words settle. Choice 2 is that I walk out of this room, and I will make 2 calls. The first will be to a very persistent detective in the Cook County District Attorney's Office who is already looking into this matter. The second call will be to a certain private lending group with offices in Las Vegas. I have their number. I imagine they would be absolutely fascinated to learn about this trust and about the fact that you have failed so spectacularly to secure the funds to pay them back. Your choice, Marcus. The pen or the phone? The transformation was absolute. Every last shred of Marcus's arrogance, his rage, his entitlement evaporated in an instant. It was replaced by a raw, primal terror that seemed to hollow him out from the inside. He stared at the file as if it were a venomous snake. He looked at Ilara, and in her calm, unyielding gaze, he saw not a wife he could bully, but an executioner. He looked at his own lawyer, who was staring back at him with a new expression of dawning horror and professional disgust. It was over. Evelyn Reed, without a word, slid a single piece of paper and a pen in front of him. With a hand that shook so violently he could barely hold the pen, Marcus Vance signed his name, a desperate, pathetic scrawl that was the official record of his own annihilation. He didn't say a word. He pushed his chair back, stood on trembling legs, and walked out of the room, a man already dead, just waiting for the burial. In the profound silence that followed Marcus's exit, the only sound in the sterile conference room was the whisper of the air conditioning. He didn't just leave the room. He seemed to have been erased by it, his presence dissolving into nothingness, leaving behind only the ugly, shaking signature on the document that lay in the center of the table. It was a treaty of unconditional surrender. Ilara stared at it, her chest rising and falling with a slow, deep breath. It wasn't the giddy thrill of winning the lottery. It was the solemn, bone-deep relief of a soldier surviving a war. Evelyn Reed reached over and gently patted her hand. "It's over, Ilara," she said, her voice soft with a professional respect that went far beyond a typical client relationship. "You won." And in that moment, Ilara knew the victory had little to do with the money. The victory was in that piece of paper, in the silence of the room, in the ghost that would never haunt her again. Marcus Vance vanished as completely as he had the first time, but the nature of his disappearance was fundamentally different. 15 years ago, he had left as a man running toward a self-invented fantasy, leaving behind a trail of broken promises. This time, he fled as a man running from the wreckage of his own life, leaving behind nothing but the stark evidence of his own ruin. By that evening, his car was gone from his mother's driveway. His phone number was disconnected. He became a whisper, a cautionary tale. He was swallowed by the dark, debt-ridden world he had created for himself, his fate unknown, and, to the family he had terrorized, irrelevant. He was finally, truly, a ghost. His mother, Beatrice, was not afforded such a clean escape. Her punishment was to remain behind, a living monument to her son's disgrace. In a small town, secrets have a short shelf life. The story of the lawsuit was already known, but the story of its abrupt, humiliating end began to circulate. People pieced it together, the smear campaign, the sudden appearance of a fancy lawyer, followed by Marcus's second, even more pathetic, vanishing act. The narrative that Beatrice had so carefully crafted of her brilliant, victimized son collapsed into a sordid tale of greed and failure. The community's judgment was not loud or confrontational. It was a quiet, collective turning of the back. The invitations to church potlucks stopped coming. The friendly chats in the grocery aisle were replaced with averted eyes and polite, clipped responses. The friends she had once entertained with stories of her son's potential now crossed the street to avoid her. She was left to live out her days in her impeccably clean house, a prisoner of her own pride, haunted by the deafening silence of a disgraced legacy. Her son had been her life's work, her masterpiece, and he had crumbled to dust in her hands. The drive home from the mediation was quiet, but it was a comfortable silence, the kind that settles after a fever breaks. It was the sound of a family processing the end of a long and painful siege. When they walked through their own front door, the air in the house felt different, lighter, cleaner. The oppressive weight of the conflict had lifted. It was in that newly peaceful space that Chloe finally broke. She looked at her mother, her face pale, her eyes filled with a deep, painful understanding of how close she had come to betraying them all. "Mom," she whispered, her voice cracking as tears began to stream down her face. "I'm so sorry. I was so stupid. He showed me this shiny, beautiful world and I wanted to believe in it. I almost believed him." She collapsed into her mother's arms, her body shaking with sobs of shame and relief. Elara held her daughter tightly, stroking her hair. There was no anger in her heart, no "I told you so" on her lips, only a profound, maternal ache for the innocence her daughter had almost lost. "Oh, honey," Elara murmured, her own eyes filling with tears. That was his greatest talent. He could sell a dream to anyone. "It wasn't your fault that you were thirsty, and he offered you poisoned water. It's okay. We're okay now." Liam, who had been watching from the doorway, his own face etched with a complex mix of emotions, came forward. He didn't say anything. He simply put his hand on Chloe's shoulder, a silent gesture of forgiveness and solidarity. In that moment, the three of them were no longer just a mother, a son, and a daughter. They were a single, unbreakable unit, forged and tempered in the fires of betrayal, their bonds stronger than ever. The true jackpot was not the money. It was this quiet, tearful, unshakable reunion in their small living room. In the weeks that followed, a new kind of peace settled over their lives. Elara Vance was no longer just a lottery winner, a title that had always felt ill-fitting, like a costume she was forced to wear. The random chance of the lottery had made her rich, but the fight with Marcus had made her powerful. It had revealed a strength and a strategic brilliance she never knew she possessed. The weary, long-suffering woman who had worked double shifts and cried in her car was gone. In her place stood a quiet matriarch, the fierce and clever protector of her family. She kept the signed withdrawal agreement in a safe deposit box. It was her true trophy, a document worth more than any nine-figure bank statement, for it was the proof of her own liberation. She had faced the ghost of her past, not with anger or fear, but with intelligence and resolve, and she had banished him to the darkness forever. The storm had passed, the monster was slain, and for the first time, in a very, very long time, Elara Vance looked toward the future and saw nothing but clear, open sky. A year passed. The violent storm of Marcus's return receded, first into a painful memory, and then into a scar that no longer ached to the touch. The great fortune, the very thing that had been the catalyst for so much chaos, settled quietly into the background of their lives, becoming not a source of drama, but a foundation for a new and gentle peace. Their lives were not transformed into a spectacle of extravagant wealth, for that was never who they were. The changes were quieter, deeper, and infinitely more meaningful. Elara quit her jobs at the diner and the office building. The perpetual weariness that had been her constant companion for 15 years finally lifted from her shoulders. She spent her mornings in her garden, not desperately trying to grow vegetables to supplement their meals, but cultivating roses for the simple, profound joy of watching something beautiful grow. Her greatest project, however, was one she undertook in secret. Through Evelyn Reed, she anonymously established and endowed a foundation in the town, the Sparrow Fund, dedicated to providing immediate, no-questions-asked financial aid to single mothers facing a crisis. She would read the monthly reports, the stories of women who were able to fix their car to get to work or pay a medical bill without fear of eviction, and she felt a quiet satisfaction that was worth more than any jewel or luxury car. She was using her miracle to create smaller miracles for women who were once just like her. Liam, with a carefully planned loan from the trust, started his own landscaping company. He found a deep, grounding pleasure in the hard, honest work of building things that would last: stone patios, lush gardens, sturdy fences. He was creating beauty and order, a tangible and deliberate contrast to the chaos and deceit his father had sown. He was becoming the man his father only ever pretended to be. Chloe, meanwhile, had transferred to the state university and was pursuing a degree in social work. The traumatic encounter with her father had stripped away her naive fantasies and replaced them with a fierce empathy. She had seen firsthand how a skilled manipulator could prey on vulnerability, and she dedicated herself to a future of helping others navigate the darkness she had so narrowly escaped. The house was once again filled with the easy rhythm of a family at peace, their shared trauma now a source of unbreakable strength. Then, on a quiet autumn afternoon, an ordinary day like any other, a letter arrived. It was in a plain white envelope, with no return address, just a faded postmark from a small town in New Mexico. Her name and address were written in a neat, unfamiliar cursive. Alara sat at her kitchen table, a place of so much past worry and recent peace, and opened it. The letter began without greeting. I imagine you have no reason to read this, and every reason to hate the woman writing it. My name is Amelia. I was the woman Marcus left with 15 years ago. I know you believe I was his partner in crime. The truth is, I was his first victim after he left you. He sold me a dream, the same way I'm sure he once sold one to you. A business partnership in Chicago. He was charming, convincing. He persuaded me to liquidate my life savings to invest. When his scheme inevitably collapsed and he was being sued for fraud, he told me we had to run, that dangerous competitors were trying to ruin us. And so we ran. Alara's hands trembled slightly as she continued to read. The letter chronicled a life on the run, a desperate existence of moving from one city to the next, of lies and near discoveries. But it was the next paragraph that made the breath catch in her throat. The real reason we could never stop running, the reason he could never have a real job or a real identity, happened on the night we fled Chicago. We were arguing. He was driving, his eyes wild with panic and rage. It was raining hard. He took a corner too fast and we hit something. It was a person, Alara. I know it was. A man walking on the shoulder of the road. I screamed at him to stop, but he accelerated. He just kept shouting that it was a deer, that I was hysterical, but I saw the man's face for a second in the headlights. We never stopped. That is the secret he has been running from all these years. He wasn't just a con man who skipped town. He was a fugitive who left a man to die on the side of a highway. After that night, he was a different person, colder, more paranoid. I finally found the courage to leave him a few years later, and I've been looking over my shoulder ever since. The letter ended, its final words, a shocking, unexpected gift of closure. I read about your lottery win in an online paper. I saw his name, and my blood ran cold. I was so afraid for you and your children. But then I read that you had won, that he had left with nothing. I just wanted to write this to say thank you. You did what I was always too terrified to do. You faced the monster and you put him back in the dark. In saving your own family, you gave me my freedom too. I hope you find the peace you so richly deserve. Alara read the letter twice, then slowly, she walked to her backyard and, in a small metal basin, she lit the letter on fire. She watched as the neat cursive, the terrible secrets, and the unexpected absolution turned to gray, curling ash, and drifted away on the gentle autumn breeze. The story was finally, completely, over. The last ghost was gone. And so we come to the end of our tale, and to a simple, unshakable truth. Never underestimate the quiet resolve of a person who has endured too much for too long, for when they finally decide to stand up, they do not just speak. They become a force of nature, a force that can build fortresses, unearth secrets, and command the storms of justice. They remind us that the deepest strength is not found in the absence of scars, but in the courage to never let them define you. Thank you for listening. We invite you to join us again for the next story.